Good morning, church. And thank you, Doug, for a great update in terms of what's going on. Before we jump into the message this morning, I want to take just a couple of minutes to talk about the possibility of reopening and going to live services. I know that that is on your mind. I know that a lot of people are anxious to get back together. We're missing being apart. And so please don't count the next couple of minutes as part of the length of the message this morning. So I will let you know that when we're actually starting the stopwatch on the message. But a couple of things about reopening. First, in terms of social distancing, we will take all the guidelines into that. We will continue to social distance in terms of seating, in terms of entrances and exits. We will pay attention to wearing masks. We'll have no shaking of hands. We'll have no hugs. We will not do, as Paul instructed us to do, greet one another with a holy kiss. We will take into consideration safety precautions, sanitation of chairs, equipment, tables, things that people might touch. We will take into consideration safety precautions regarding our children's program and how to or whether to serve coffee. I don't know if it's biblical to have church without coffee, but we will take into consideration how we serve it, new ways of distributing communion, new ways of taking offerings. I don't know if you knew this, but I was involved in a church where, as the senior pastor, we didn't take an offering for all 14 years that I was there. And yet God provided week after week, month after month, year after year in terms of that congregation. I know that several people, no matter what kind of precautions that we take, and it's being right now, there are two teams going about writing positional papers about reopening and what that will look like. We have Dave Ramarine and Will Walker and Helen Wong, who are really taking into consideration the draft of reopening the church. And Megan, our preschool director, is taking the lead in terms of how to reopen Timber Hills Preschool. We will have that information to you, and so that you can take a look at it and feel comfortable. I know that some people are not going to feel comfortable right away, that you're gonna wait. And we just want you to know that we will continue to do online services. This is not something that was here just for the pandemic. It will continue afterwards. We're still trying to get up to enough people to subscribe to our YouTube channel. So if you will go to YouTube to Go FCC and subscribe to our YouTube channel, we're about 20 people short of being able to post all of our services on YouTube as well as Instagram, as well as Facebook. That means that we would be able to link it to our website, and you could access the service on our website. So if you would do that. I want to encourage you during this time to be gentle and kind and compassionate to other people that aren't as anxious about getting back together and being physically together. And I want you to be kind and compassionate towards yourself during this time. Be safe. Be healthy. You know, we need to get ahead of this virus. We need to defeat it now. And we are going to reopen as soon as we can. But as I talk about compassion, now you can start the clock on the morning's message. In fact, we just had somebody look at their watch already with the worship team in terms of, so I'm going to be timed here. I want to open today with a quote from actress Viola Davis. She's an incredible actress. And this quote is about a co-star that she had in a movie called Fences. Her husband in that, she played the wife of a husband who was a bitter man because he was a great baseball player that was confined to the Negro Baseball League because Jackie Robinson hadn't broken the color barrier yet. And he was a great player, but he never made it to the majors. By the time that Jackie had broken the color barrier, he was too old and nobody would sign him. And he was bitter. And it was a great movie. She played a wonderful role as the wife. And her co-star, this is what she said about him. He's a regular guy that is not attracted to his own celebrity. He's a jokester, a little rough around the edges with great heart and compassion. He loves his family. I feel very comfortable with him. I don't see Denzel Washington star. I just see Denzel. Denzel Washington is one of those guys that I would love to spend an afternoon with. I think he would be a fascinating person to talk to and to learn more about. And Viola Davis says he's a jokester, he's a little rough around the edges, he loves his family, I feel comfortable with him. But what do we learn in that one quote from her? He has a great heart and he's full of compassion. You know, compassion is one of those qualities in a person's life that's extremely attractive. When you're around a compassionate person, there's something about them that's like a magnet. You want to get to know them better. Pastor and author Max Lucado says this about compassion. He says, there's something about compassion that causes society to say, we're going to take this person seriously. Take Mother Teresa. She was confrontational on abortion, but she wasn't rejected by society. Then Max goes on to say this, compassion in evangelical churches is out of balance. When I talk about it, I get a lot of glazed expressions. Can you imagine that? There's something that the church doesn't understand about compassion. He gets confused looks. He goes on to say this. For years I thought my assignment, or the church's assignment, was to articulate the gospel and nothing more. Now I believe that if we don't support the verbal expression of the gospel with physical demonstration of compassion, we are not imitating Jesus. Did you catch that? If we don't support the verbal expression of the gospel with physical demonstration of compassion, we're not like Jesus. You see, it used to be the church would proclaim the gospel. Today, no one's listening unless we first demonstrate the good news, unless we embody the good news, unless we imitate Jesus. I love this passage about Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. It says, he went through the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Did you catch the word? Jesus was moved by compassion. When Eugene Peterson translates this, this is what he says. Jesus made a circuit of all the towns and villages. He taught in their meeting places, reported kingdom news, and healed their diseased bodies, healed their bruised and hurt lives. And when he looked out over the crowd, his heart broke. His heart broke. So confused and aimless, they were like sheep with no shepherd. What a huge harvest, he said to his disciples. How few workers. On your knees and pray for harvest hands. Jesus' heart broke when he saw the needs of people. He was moved by compassion. The word compassion means far more than feeling sympathy for others. It means to suffer with, to struggle with another situation that causes the pain and the hurt and desires to alleviate or eliminate it. Compassion moves a person to say, I must do something about this. And so when we look at this series, we've looked so far, Pastor Christy took us through foster care in terms of Foster the Bay in the Bay Area. Doug, 2 weeks ago, talked about hunger and homelessness and our opportunity to be involved in Compassion Network and Mission for the Homeless. In the coming weeks, we're going to address things like prisoners and teenagers and children with disabilities and sex traffic victims. But this morning, we're going to address a pandemic that has claimed the lives of over 3.5 million people this year and affects another 785 million people around the globe, almost 1 billion people. That's 1 in every 10 of us this particular pandemic is impacting. The equivalent of that is one jumbo jet airliner full of passengers, no social distancing, full of passenger crashing every hour of every day of every week for the entire year. It's the equivalent of all the deaths caused by violence, war, terrorism, homicide for the whole year. It's over 35 times the number of deaths attributed to the COVID-19 virus thus far in the United States. Over 3.5 million people will die from this pandemic this year, just like last year and the year before and the year before and the year before. I'm not talking about the coronavirus. I'm talking about disease that is caused for the lack of clean drinking water. So, instead of telling you anything more about it, let us show you this brief clip from an organization called Charity Water. Water changes everything. We don't think about it because if we get thirsty, we go to the sink, turn on the faucet, and we get water. You know, one of the biggest industries now in America is bottled water. One day, Jody and I were on a trip someplace. I can't remember where we were, but we stopped to get gas. I went inside. I told her I was going to go get some bottled water, and I came out, and I had 2 bottled waters, Smart Water. Raise your hand, even at home, if you've ever drank Smart Water. And I said to Jody, I said, you know, I have no idea what makes this water smart, but I thought I'd try it. And she looked at me and she said, well, it was smart enough to get you to buy it. So if you think about that, I don't know. I don't think it increased my IQ points anywhere. You might look at this and you say, well, that's an interesting video, but what does it really say? How does an organization begin to have an impact on 1/10 of the world's population? How can we even imagine what Jesus meant when he said, when I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink? 785 million times. Well, one of the things that I think about is the story of the founder of Charity Water. And I'm not going to go into details because even as this series or this service is going on this morning, Will Walker is sending out an email to you that you'll get in your email box today that will give you a link to a video of Scott Harrison's life story in terms of how he went from a self-centered, self-promoting, self-serving person to somebody who started this worldwide charity to provide clean water and address this issue. He did it by giving up his 30th birthday, and instead of having a party for himself, he asked people to come and give $20. Just $20 in lieu of birthday presents or cards, $20 to this cause. They raised enough money to build 6 wells from that one birthday party. And they were off and going. And year to date now, they started in 2006, and year to date they have raised $370 million and drilled 51,000 wells in 29 countries. One person, one birthday party launching this worldwide movement. It is an inspiring video. Please take the time to watch it when you get it. But I want you to know that this issue about compassion, being moved by compassion, where someone else's suffering becomes our suffering, where their heartbreak breaks our heart, where their needs become our cause. We're the people that Jesus prayed for when he said, the harvest is plentiful. Pray that the Lord of the harvest would send forth workers. Who do you think the workers are? We are. We've been sent. We have been sent to deal with the issues here. Water is a big deal. Jesus talked about the fact that he said, surely anyone who gives a cup of cold water to a little one in my name, his will not lose his reward. Water is a big deal in Palestine. It's a big deal in arid, dry climates. You think back in terms of the founder of the Jewish people, Abraham. When Abraham was 75 years old, he got a promise from God that he would be the father of a great nation. So many descendants that if you could count the sand, the grains of sand on the seashore, you'd be able to count his descendants. His wife was 65. Do you see a bit of a problem here? He's 75, she's 65, pretty much beyond having children at that moment. But Sarai, she hadn't been named Sarah yet. Sarai found comfort in that because her shame was going to be removed because she was going to become a mother. But flash forward in Genesis chapter 16, it's been 10 years, and now Sarai is 75, and Abram is 85, and she's still barren, no children. So we pick up the story in Genesis 16, and it says that she had an Egyptian maid named Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, God has not seen fit to let me have a child. Sleep with my maid Hagar. Maybe I can get a family from her. And Abraham agreed to do so and did what Sarah had suggested. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took her Egyptian maid Hagar and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife. And Abram, who had been living 10 years in Canaan when this took place, he slept with Hagar and she got pregnant. And when Hagar learned she was pregnant, she looked down on her mistress. Hagar looked down on Sarai. And Sarai told Abram, it's all your fault that I'm suffering this abuse. I put my maid in bed with you, and the minute she knows she's pregnant, she treats me like I'm nothing. May God decide what is right. Abram said, you decide. Your maid is your business. And Sarai was abusive to Hagar, and Hagar ran away. Let me stop for a second. Have you ever felt like you knew what God wanted to do in a situation, but God was taking too long to do it? Have you ever been, am I preaching to anybody this morning, have you ever been in a situation where you thought, I know what God's going to do, but He's taking too long? And so you design your own solution, only to realize later that your great solution became your new big problem. And that's exactly what happened to Sarah in this situation. 10 years is a long time to wait, especially when you've already waited 65 years. And so she took matters in her own hands. And when she got her solution, she wasn't happy with her solution because it wasn't God's. And so Hagar ran away. The angel of the Lord found her beside a spring in the desert. And it was the spring on the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, maid of Sarai, what are you doing here? And she said, I'm running away from Sarai, my mistress. And the angel of God said, go back to your mistress, put up with her abuse. I'm going to give you a big family, children, past counting. The amazing thing is that what Hagar goes on to say is, she answered God by name, praying to the God who spoke to her, you're the God who sees me. Did you hear that phrase? You're the God who sees me. Stop for a moment. I don't know what you're dealing with now. I don't know if you're dealing with unemployment. I don't know if you're dealing with the fact that you don't know where next month's house payment or rent is coming from. I don't know if you are wondering if you own a company, if you're going to be able to stay in business. I know the fears that we all have and the things that we struggle with and the challenges that seem overwhelming. But here's the good news. God sees us. God doesn't look down in terms of America or the world in terms of all the major problems. He doesn't look at 3.5 million people suffering from the lack of clean drinking water. He sees each individual suffering from the lack of clean drinking water. He sees each foster care child. He sees each hungry person. He sees each sex-trafficked person. He sees every prisoner. He sees all of us in our individual circumstances and knowing what we're dealing with. So Hagar goes back and she gives birth to a son. And that son's name is Ishmael. And the years continue to pile up. It's been 10 years, and then it's 15, and then it's 20, and then it's 24. And God reiterates His promise to Abram. Only He has changed his name to Abraham, and He tells him that Sarah will have a child the next year. Abraham was 100 years old, and Sarah was 90 when their son was born. Can you imagine? Waiting 25 years. 25 years. Do you know what makes a joke really funny? I know this doesn't sound like it connects, but it does. You know what makes the punchline of a joke really funny? The joke's taking you down this avenue over here. And suddenly the punchline happens. And if the punchline's just a little off from where you were going, you might get a smile. If it's a little further off than where it was going, you might get a chuckle. If it's somewhat off, you might get a laugh. But it is way off from what you expect. You get fall on the ground, roll around laughter. Can you imagine how funny this must seem to Sarah that at 90 she has a baby? It might be why they named their son Isaac, which translated means he laughs. Every time they call him, she remembers how joyful it is, how funny it is, how unexpected it was. But now, got to realize in the same house, she's got a solution that she came up with 14 years previous. His name is Ishmael, living with Isaac. So the story goes on, and it says, the baby grew, meaning Isaac, and was weaned. And according to rabbinic tradition, that was anywhere between 18 months to 5 years before a baby was weaned. Many people think that Isaac was probably 5 years old when this happened. And Abraham threw a big party on that day that Isaac was weaned. You think Abraham threw a party. I just can't imagine what Sarah threw. But one day Sarah saw the son that Hagar the Egyptian was born to Abraham, poking fun at her son Isaac. And she told Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son. No child of this slave is going to share inheritance with my son Isaac. And the matter gave great pain to Abram. After all, Ishmael was his son. But God spoke to Abraham, don't feel badly about the boy and your maid. Do whatever Sarah tells you. Your descendants will come through Isaac. Regarding your maid's son, Ishmael, be assured that I also develop a great nation from him. He's your son too. So Abraham got up the next morning, got some food together, and a canteen of water for Hagar, put them on her back, and sent her away with the child. She wandered off into the desert of Beersheba. Remember, this is an arid, dry desert. And when the water was gone, she left the child under a scrub and went off 50 yards or so. And she said, I can't watch my son die. And she sat and she broke into tears. Meanwhile, God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called from heaven to Hagar. What's wrong, Hagar? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy and knows the fix he's in. Up now, get the boy, hold him tight. I'm going to make him a great nation. Do you notice in both situations, in Genesis 16 and in Genesis 21, it says who shows up is the angel of the Lord. I want you to understand one thing. Every time you see in the Old Testament the phrase, the angel of the Lord, it's a reference to a pre-incarnate showing up of Jesus. Jesus is the one who saw Hagar in the desert in Genesis 16, and Jesus is the one who hears Ishmael cry in Genesis 21. Isn't it interesting? Jesus, moved with compassion, shows up in the need of someone in a dry desert. God rescues them, and of course, Ishmael became a great nation. Now you look at that and you say, well, okay, here's the way that some people could interpret this. God shows up. God knows the cry. So Roger, why are 3.5 million people dying for lack of clean water? Because I believe God wants to show up in you and in me. The Holy Spirit lives inside of disciples of Jesus. He wants you and me to show up. He wants us to be His hands, His feet, to drill wells, to create places of water, to eradicate disease. He expects us to be there. I love this quote from Mother Teresa. She said, never worry about numbers, because 3.5 million people is overwhelming to think about, right? Or 785 million people that don't have clean drinking water. That's overwhelming to think about. Mother Teresa says, don't worry ever about numbers. Help one person at a time and start with the person nearest you. Start with one person at a time and start with the person that's nearest you. So let's go back a couple of weeks ago when Pastor Christie talked about Foster the Bay and foster children. There are 7,000 foster children in the Bay Area that need a place to live and a good, stable upbringing and family. 7,000 in the Bay Area. If every church in the Bay Area just took in 2, we could eliminate the need for foster care. I have a friend in Sacramento, a businessman that wanted to have an impact on the foster care system. So he got a group of other businessmen, Christian businessmen, to start mentoring foster kids. He started mentoring foster kids because Doug told me, he said the reason is that we discovered that less than 50% of foster children ever graduate from high school and less than 3% graduate from college. So their earning ability, their futures are impacted because of illiteracy or the lack of opportunity. He said, so we started mentoring them. One of the things that they did was they created a list of 100 books that they wanted them all to read. And every time they would read a book and write a book report, they would pay them $100. So you imagine if a student were to read 10 of these books, write a book report, they could make $1,000. If you read all 100, you could make $10,000. And then they made sure they got into college, and then they made sure that they graduated. And when they graduated, here's one of the things they did. They helped them get prepared for their first interviews as they applied for jobs. And one of the things that they did is they took them on a shopping spree, and each of these mentors would buy their mentees $500 worth of new clothes. What Doug told me was, Roger, you wouldn't believe it, but time and time again, we heard from the foster kids, it was the first time they had bought new clothes. They'd always got hand-me-downs or clothes from thrift stores. This was the first time they ever bought new clothes. I was in another meeting one time where I heard someone raise a hand in terms of asking questions about foster care. Raise their hand and say, here's my question. If we take a foster care kid, our foster child into our home, when we go on family vacation, do we have to take him or her with us? Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? I mean, stop for a second. Do we have to take him or her with us? That may be one of the reasons that when somebody ages out from a foster care situation, 65% of the kids are homeless. We have work to do in terms of foster care, and I hope that you will join us on Tuesday night for the prayer time for foster children. When Doug talked about hunger 2 weeks ago, one statistic I read this week is 41 million Americans face hunger on a weekly basis. 13 million of them are children. Before the COVID-19 situation, the Bay Area was serving 130,000, but COVID has not made things trickle, it's become a tsunami, and it's more than doubled the number of people who need food and sustenance and meals. And then we have this situation about clean water. Brings us to the question, as we begin to wrap up this message, brings us to the question, what can we do? First, we can be informed. We can be informed. An email will go out during this service, I told you, in which you can see the story of Charity Water and Scott Harrison's own personal story that led him to start this foundation. Embedded in that link will be an invitation to a Zoom meeting that's going to happen this Thursday morning with a representative from Charity Water. I would encourage you to be on that Zoom call just to hear about what they're doing and how we can help. Did you know a dollar investment yields between $4 to $12 of economic yield in terms of this issue? You can pledge your birthday. You can give up your birthday and invite people to come and give money to this cause. 51,000 wells, 29 countries, $370 million raised in less than 15 years. Plus, all money that goes towards this, none of it goes to overhead. They do fundraising in a different situation to raise their overhead. $370 million went to build wells and sanitation projects and to increase the livelihood of people and to spread the good news. Or you can go on a short-term mission trip that I'm going to talk about at the conclusion of this series, an opportunity that we have to be involved in the second poorest area in the United States. But I'm going to save that towards the end. You never understand how one life can turn into so many other people. One birthday party started this crazy, crazy ride that Charity Water's been on. But again, it comes down to, hey, I'm just one individual. I live here in the Bay Area. What can I do? I can't dig a well. I'm sheltered in place. I'm comfortable. You can be moved by compassion. Let me close with one story. ABC News used to do a segment every week at the end of the week called the Person of the Week. On April 2nd, 2004, they gave out that award like they normally did, Person of the Week. And what they would always do was list the accomplishments of this man or woman, and people would start guessing, oh, I know who it is, I know who it is. No one had a clue as to who this was. They didn't have any understanding. And when they announced this guy, who was 91 years old at the time, no one knew who it was. They said, and now the Person of the Week is Norman Borlaug. Anybody know Norman Borlaug? I didn't know Norman Borlaug. But apparently he's responsible for changing the world that we live in. In the 1940s, he hybridized high-yield, disease-resistant corn and wheat for arid climates. From the Dust Bowl of Western Africa to our own desert southeast, from South and Central America to the plains of Siberia, across Europe and Asia, Borlaug's seed flourished where none had ever been able to grow before. He was credited in 2004, the reason he was Person of the Week, he was credited for saving 2 billion lives. 2 billion lives. But maybe he got too much credit. Maybe it wasn't his award to win. Maybe it was Henry Wallace. See, Henry Wallace was the Vice President of the United States under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I know you might be thinking, well, no, Harry Truman was the vice president, but Truman was one of 3 vice presidents that served under Roosevelt because he served 4 terms. And Henry Wallace was the vice president from 1941 to 1945. He was the former Secretary of Agriculture. He was dumped for Harry Truman on the ticket. But when he was the vice president, he used the power of the office to create a station in Mexico whose sole purpose was to hybridize wheat and corn for arid climates. And he hired Norman Borlaug to run it. So maybe Henry Wallace should have been given credit for saving 2 billion lives. Or maybe we should give credit to the man known for his work with the peanut, George Washington Carver. When Carver was 19 years old, he was a student at Iowa State University and had a dairy science professor who on Saturdays let his 6-year-old son go on botanical expeditions with the 19-year-old college student. George Washington Carver instilled in little 6-year-old Henry Wallace a love for plants and a vision for what they could do for humanity. Carver came up with 266 different things that we can do with a peanut, that we still do it, and 88 different things that we can do with sweet potato. So maybe Carver should be given credit for saving 2 billion lives. Or, let me just go one more. Maybe it should be a farmer from Diamond, Missouri, whose name was Moses, and his wife's name was Susan, that should be given credit. They lived in the 19th century in a slave state, but they didn't believe in slavery. And even though Susan was white, her best friend was an African-American woman by the name of Mary Washington, who lived on the farm. On a January night, the Quantrell raiders rode through Moses and Susan's farm, killing several people, burned down their barn, and kidnapped Mary Washington, who wouldn't let go of her baby boy. Moses got word out the next morning and secured a meeting with the raiders. He rode all night on his one horse that he owned and met 4 of Quantrell's men. He traded his horse for the contents in a dirty burlap bag. It was Mary's son, George. Freezing, almost dead, Moses opened up his jacket, his shirt, and he held the little baby close to his chest, covered him, and began to walk home. And as he walked home, he promised the little boy that he would take care of him, and he promised to educate him in honor of his mother that he knew was dead. That is an act of compassion. Moved by compassion to save a life, he gave up what he had because he identified with the suffering and the problem and the pain and took in little George Washington, and that night said, I'm going to give you my last name. Moses and Susan Carver. George Washington became George Washington Carver, who as a 19-year-old passed on a love for plants to little 6-year-old Henry Wallace, who became the Vice President of the United States and the Secretary of Agriculture, who created this ability to grow seed in arid, dry climates that saved 2 billion lives. That was back in 2004. I'm sure it's well over 3 billion lives by now. How did it all start? One act of compassion. What am I asking you to do? I'm asking you to pay attention. I'm asking you to pay attention to the needs around you. In your own block, in your own house, in your own community, in your own places of work, on Zoom calls, pay attention to the needs of others. and trust God to move you with compassion to be involved. Because you don't know when one act of compassion can move into meeting the needs of incredible people, one person at a time, that grows into an incredible need. I'm going to ask the worship team to come up as I close in prayer. Pray with me. God, I pray that we would do the very courageous thing right now. As we close in prayer, we actually open our minds and our hearts, asking you to move in us. God, there's needs everywhere. But I love what Mother Teresa said. Start with one person and start with the one nearest you. God, turn us into people with compassion. Move us. God, there's so many needs. Help us to get out of being self-centered in terms of what we need, knowing that you see us, you hear us, you can provide for us. Move us to a situation, God, where we begin to provide for others. You said the harvest is ripe, the field is ripe. Pray for workers. Help us to be those workers. People of compassion. People that attract others. And what they see in us is not how great we are, but how great Jesus is. And that He can move in them the same way He moves in us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.